Now, the greatest radio shows of all time.
Suspense.
The Shadow Node.
Washington calling David Harding, counter-spy.
Classic radio theater.
The Great Gildersleeve.
Fibber McGee and Molly.
Dragnet. Gunsmoke.
The Lone Ranger.
Now, step back into a time machine with your host, Wyatt Cox.
Good evening, friends of the Inner Sanctum.
An episode of the NBC program Wanted, going back 72 years, September 29th, 1950, and the case of Gladys Tibbet's Glasgow Stewart. A little more complicated, almost as complicated as the name. We thank you for joining us on this Thursday, 29th day of September, 272nd day of the year, 93 days remaining till we get to 2023. War Department first established regular army with a strength of several hundred men in 1789. First Congress also adjourned on that same date. Cornerstone laid at Washington National Cathedral on this date in 1907. General Eisenhower, Italian Marshal Pietro Bagolia signed an armistice aboard the British ship Nelson off the shore of Malta. Dobie Gillis, the many loves of Dobie Gillis, the television show, premiered on this date. Max Schulman's short stories adapted as scripts for the show. Dwayne Hickman starred as Dobie. His best friend Maynard G. Krebs was played by Bob Denver. He would later become Gilligan on Gilligan's Island. Vice President Spiro T. Agnew on this date in 1973 declared he was totally innocent of the charges that he accepted bribes when he was the governor of Maryland.
I am innocent of the charges against me. I want to make another thing so clear that it cannot be mistaken in the future. Because of these tactics which have been employed against me, because small and fearful men have been frightened into furnishing evidence against me, they have perjured themselves in many cases, it's my understanding. I will not resign if indicted. I will not resign if indicted.
On October 10th of that same year, 1973, he was allowed to plead no contest to a single charge that he had failed to report almost $30,000 of income in 1967, with the condition that he resign the office of vice president. Nixon later replaced Agnew by appointing House Minority Leader Gerald Ford as vice president. A Tylenol scare began on this date in 1982 when the first of 7 individuals died in metropolitan Chicago after ingesting extra-strength Tylenol that had been deliberately contaminated with cyanide.
It's very obvious that these capsules were tampered with. It was not an accidental thing. It was not a product defect. It was not something that was occurred in the stream of distribution. It was willful and wanton and very deadly.
Johnson & Johnson spokesman Tyrone Thanner, crime was never solved. It changed the way a lot of things happen. Of course, tamper-proof bottles, and they basically got rid of using capsules that would easily dissolve, going to the harder tablets and the caplets, which didn't dissolve as well as capsules did. That happened on this date. NASA resumed space shuttle flights that had been grounded after the Challenger disaster on this date in 1988.
We have main engine start. 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
Discovery kicks and goes straight up into a Florida blue sky atop a tower of flame and smoke. Almost 3 years after the Challenger tragedy, the space shuttle is flying again. All 5 astronauts pushed back in their seats now. The power of 7.5 million pounds of thrust. You can hear the roar from the launch pad across the range here. Discovery roars up into the Florida sky, now rolling over, headed for space.
Space Shuttle Discovery roaring back to space on this date in 1998. The Nintendo 64 released in North America on this date in 1996. John Roberts confirmed by the Senate to be the next Chief Justice of the Supreme Court on this date in 2005. And following the bankruptcies of Lehman Brothers and Washington Mutual, Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 777.68 points on this date in 2008. That was the largest single-day point loss in its history up to that time. The House defeated a $700 billion emergency rescue plan for the nation's financial system on that same date in 2008. Among those passing away on this date, Casey Stengel, the baseball player and manager, businessman Henry Ford II, cartoonist Charles Addams, a man behind the Addams Family, actor Tony Curtis, and singer Helen Reddy. This is the birth date of actress Greer Garson, also Gene Autry. I'm back in the saddle again. Fine businessman. He owned a number of radio stations as well back in the day. Film director Stanley Kramer, Swedish actress Anita Ekberg, pro wrestler but better known as a manager Skandor Akbar, born on this date. Frank Burns on MASH, Larry Linville, born on this date, as was actress Madeline Kahn. Happy birthday number 87. To the killer, Jerry Lee Lewis, the last surviving member of Sun Records' $1 Million Quartet, along with Elvis, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash. Jerry Lee Lewis, 87 years old today. Yes, the killer is still with us. French jazz violinist Jean-Luc Ponty is 80. Brian Gumbel, the television personality, was on 15 years, if memory serves correctly, on the Today Show. Brian Gumbel, 74 today. Grand Funk Railroad guitarist Mark Farner is 74 today. John Black on Days of Our Lives. Drake Hodgson is 69. Isn't it sad that they're moving all the good soap operas to streaming? Yeah, Days of Our Lives now on Peacock. Strangeness. Andrew Dice Clay, the comedian, 65 today. Love Boats, Jill Whalen, 56 today. Baywatch actress Erika Eleniak is 53. Stand-up comedian Russell Peters, 52. From This Is Us, Chrissy Metz, 42. And from Chuck and Shazam, Zachary Levy is 42. Those some of the people celebrating the 29th day of September is their birthday. If this is your birthday...
Hi, we're the 4 freshmen, and we just want to say, Happy birthday to you!
72 years ago, September 29th, 1950, Wanted, coming up next on this Thursday, Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox on your favorite station.
You know, it's true. Difficult times have a way of focusing us. We have to think about what matters most when it comes to our spending, our health care. No doubt. This is why so many people are joining Medi-Share right now. Medi-Share is a trusted way to save up to 50% on your monthly health care costs. More than 400,000 people have already made the switch. It's pretty obvious why, too, especially now during this challenging season with healthcare costs and out-of-pocket expenses going up. Medi-Share can save you a lot of money. The typical family saves $500 a month. And Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry that's worked beautifully for 29 years. There are different options to choose from to fit your budget. I'll give you the number here in a second, and if you call, you can get a price within 2 minutes. Maybe now is the perfect time to make the switch and start saving. Here you go. Call 833-34-BIBLE. That's 833-34-BIBLE. 833-34-BIBLE.
Now on Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox on this Thursday, an episode of Wanted, going back 72 years, September 29th, 1950.
Wanted. Wanted for jailbreak.
Presented in the public interest, this is the program that brings you for the first time on the air a nationwide manhunt in action. This is the program that has led to the capture of 3 dangerous criminals. From the record, the on-the-spot reports of the actual people involved. Nothing is withheld, no one is protected. Here are the dramatic eyewitness accounts of a man wanted for jailbreak.
And now, Wanted's on-the-spot investigator, Walter McGraw.
Good evening. Once again, you and I are going on a nationwide manhunt for a criminal who is now at large somewhere in this country. Tonight, you will hear from the actual eyewitnesses who are involved in this case. You'll meet the fugitive's friends and family, his victims, and the police who are at this moment working on his case. Remember, each and every one of these people are putting themselves on the spot to give you first-hand information about a man who is wanted. Tonight, we're turning Wanted's spotlight on a psychopathic murderer, a man whom psychiatrists say should be segregated from his fellow men, a man to be carefully watched for the rest of his life. Yet, this is a man who is at this moment at large, possibly endangering even you. So listen, these are the facts.
The date, October 12th, 1939. The location, a quiet residential street in the small, sleepy town of Purcell, Oklahoma. A line of residential houses placed one close to the other. So close, in fact, it's an easy matter to see into the neighbors' rooms.
The voices you hear next are those of the actual people who, through no fault of their own, are involved in the case of Gladys Tibbet Glasgow Stewart and her husband, young Lieutenant Alvin Stewart. First, their next-door neighbors.
I'm Mrs. Jim Traynor of Purcell, Oklahoma. Husband and I live next door to the Stewarts. I was up tending to the children about 2:30. And on my way back to bed, I heard loud screams. I looked out of the window and saw the screams was coming from the Stewarts next door. I saw the book of a man coming through the screen door. Gladys Stewart screamed, and her husband, Sergeant Stewart, sat up in bed and says, "You have the wrong man." But the intruder says, "No, I haven't," and he shot him. Gladys screamed again, and he turned the gun in and shot her several times. Gladys fell to the floor, and he left, and then turned around and came back and hit her several times with his gun over on the head. Now here is my husband. Jim, what did you do then?
I ask you, should I shoot him? I had a 6-shooter in my hand. You said no, he is not bothering us, so let him go. I watched him so far as I could see him. And then I went on my front porch to see where he went. About 1/2 block down the street, he parked his car, and then he entered his car and drove away. And then I went out to call Sheriff Edgman.
I'm Sheriff Edgman of McLean County, Oklahoma. I received a call about 3 o'clock, and on arriving at the scene, I discovered the screen door had been forced open, and Sergeant Stewart had been shot by the intruder and was lying in bed dead. The shots and noise aroused Gladys, and she cried for her son, Dana, to go for help. She then grappled with the intruder and was shot twice in close range. I began searching the house for evidence while the wounded girl was being questioned by the county attorney, E. Smith Hester.
My name is E. Smith Hester. I was the prosecuting attorney of McLean County, Oklahoma. At the time, I was called to the home of Sergeant Stewart in the west part of Purcell. Upon my arrival there, about 2:40 in the morning, I found that Sergeant Stewart was shot through the heart and lying in bed. Mrs. Stewart had been shot twice, once through the spleen, and was bleeding badly. She advised me that she realized that she was going to die.
The dying girl, Gladys Glasgow Stewart, lapsed into unconsciousness and was taken to the hospital. County Attorney E. Smith Hester and Sheriff Edgman hoped she'd regain consciousness and make a full statement, giving the needed details of the attack. They knew from the first that this double tragedy was no accidental shooting by a prowler, but the direct result of Gladys's past life. And that past had started 10 years before. 10 years before, when Gladys was 18.
Of course, I'm no one to talk. I'm not the gossiping kind. But Gladys, well, her name was Gladys Tibbet then, when she was 18. And for a girl 18, she had a way with men. My goodness, she was so popular that, well, no other girl in town had a chance. I must admit Gladys was well, she was much prettier than any other young girl had any right to be.
Naturally, Gladys had a lot of beaux. Not that she cared for any one in particular. But every young man in town was a courting her, and even old Raymond Glasgow said she was a mighty cute trick. Of course, everybody knew Raymond Glasgow was kidding. He'd been married and past 40, but he talked about her so much he got his son Ted all steamed up, and Ted Glasgow began to call on Gladys.
They began dating steady, and it wasn't long before wedding bells rang out. It was quite a wedding. Gladys so beautiful and young, Ted so happy, and Gladys's folks, the Tibbets, thrilled to death. And even Ted's father, Raymond Glasgow, seemed happy, now that Gladys was his daughter-in-law.
Married now, Gladys faded from the public eye. And within a few short years, Ted and Gladys had a child, a son named Danny. Then gossip started again.
About this time, a fellow named Preacher Deaton was seen in and around Purcell. Fine man, the preacher. He was not only a holy man, but he happened to be an important member of the Oklahoma State Legislature. Well, with anybody that important around, folks were naturally interested in everything he did.
As for Gladys, she was happily married to Ted Glasgow. Frequently, Ted and Gladys, Ted's mother and father, old Raymond Glasgow and his wife, and Gladys's mother and father, Mr. and Mrs. Tibbet, would go out together. On Saturday night, they'd drop into one of the various roadside cafes and spend the evening having a few drinks together.
But whenever they had a few drinks together, the fight would start. Old Raymond Glasgow was a moody kind of guy, and he'd get mad over anything. Gladys had a time of it trying to keep peace in the family.
Then, on a Saturday night in the fall of 1937, the Glasgows, the Tibbets, Ted and Gladys stopped in for a drink at a place called Camp Joe.
This is Ray Hammers. I run Camp Joe. About 10:30 or 11 o'clock one night, Raymond Glasgow and his wife, young Ted Glasgow and his wife Gladys, June Tibbet and his wife came to my place, all enjoying themselves and having a good time. When a little ruckus come up between Raymond Glasgow and Tibbet. Finally, they got into a little fight, and Truman Deaton, the legislator from Pontotoc County that was happened to come through, kicked Glasgow out the door, and he came back in, he and Ted, hunting for Deaton. And we tried to stop him at the door, but he kept coming, and kept advancing on Deaton until finally he drew his gun and fired 2 shots. First shot evidently aimed at Raymond Glasgow missed. The second shot hit Ted, which killed him. After that, I called the police.
My name is Walter Woods, connected with the Sheriff Department of McLean County. I was called to Camp Joe. I was the first officer to arrive at the scene. I questioned the witnesses about the shooting that had happened there. And I found out that Preacher Deaton had shot young Glasgow. Later, I returned to town there at Purcell to put out an alarm for Deaton, but he surrendered himself to the Sheriff's Department. He admitted that he shot Glasgow, but he shot in self-defense.
Preacher Deaton, a member of Oklahoma's state legislature, was arrested for the murder of young Ted Glasgow. The small-town self-defense shooting blossomed into a statewide scandal, and the face of gorgeous Gladys and her family crashed into the headlines of every paper in the state, together with that of Preacher Deaton. And Deaton went to trial.
The jury returned a verdict of innocent, self-defense. Preacher Deaton was exonerated of any guilt in the matter of the murder of young Ted Glasgow.
Exonerated by a jury, Deaton was released. Oklahoma papers heralded his release and innocence, but that was an election year. The voting public went to the polls, and when they saw his name on the ballot...
Wasn't that the fella involved in that shooting? Sure, that's the guy that killed a man.
Imagine him running for office.
A jury had exonerated him of any guilt, but the scandal had a lasting effect, and Preacher Deaton was voted out of office. After that, no word was heard from Preacher Deaton at all. He seemed to have disappeared. As for Gladys, she was a widow now. a widow with a child.
At first, Raymond Glasgow took on something terrible about the death of his son. He seemed to feel he himself was to blame for the fracas. He wanted to make it all up to Gladys. He said he wanted to support his daughter-in-law and grandson.
Gladys turned that offer down.
A lot of other fellows offered to help. They all wanted to marry her.
Gladys turned them down.
She decided to move home with her own mother and father, the Tibbets, and to get a job.
This is Ruth Hardage. I knew Gladys Glasgow. She used to work at the Archer Lumber Company as a bookkeeper. She was liked by everyone. She used to go out on a lot of dates. She was very popular, especially with the boys.
But popular Gladys wasn't interested. Days she worked. Evenings she spent at home with son Danny and her family.
Usually she didn't have any visitors except for Raymond Glasgow. He used to drop by all the time. Usually it was some kind of a present for Danny. He used to brag to everybody that he and the youngster were great friends.
1 year passed for Gladys Tibbet Glasgow. She worked hard and was lonely.
Then Gladys met Lieutenant Stewart. He had been transferred to the CCC camp, which is located right outside of her cell. Handsome fella, this Lieutenant Alvin Stewart. Handsome and clean cut.
At first, the folks used to see Gladys and the lieutenant strolling around town together. Then they noticed that young Danny was always along. That boy took the lieutenant from the start. Well, before long, Gladys let us know that she and the lieutenant had serious intentions. And that was nice for Danny, too, since he and the lieutenant got along fine.
Another strange case on Wanted from 72 years ago, September 29th, 1950, here on Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox. Thanks for tuning in. The news from this date 72 years ago will be up next, but first, these important words. Thank you so much for tuning in to Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox here on your favorite radio station. We're listening to an episode of Wanted, as it was originally broadcast Friday, September 29th, 1950, in the newspapers of that Friday. 72 years ago, these were some of the headlines. General Douglas MacArthur triumphantly returned the capital city of Seoul to President Syngman Rhee of the Korean Republic today, only 24 hours after U.S. Marines and infantrymen had wiped out the communist defenders of Seoul, the seat of the Korean government restored to its 75-year-old president. A 6-point U.S. program for creating a free and united Korea under the guidance of the whole United Nations, outlined by American sources at the UN today. The Americans disclosed any wish for military bases in Korea and called for urgent steps to restore and rehabilitate the war-torn land. The Army will draft 300,000 more men in the 6 months from October through March and also call up 3,200 doctors and 1,400 dentists. The call for the 300,000 soldiers, in addition to the 50,000 ordered up in the September call, of whom 30,000 already have been inducted, since 20,000 men were summoned soon after the outbreak of the Korean War. That now means the Army has plans to draft at least 370,000 men. State Department officials regard Russia's latest peace drive as a determined effort by Moscow to salvage something out of the communist disaster in Korea. The reverses suffered by the Reds as a result of their Korean adventure go far beyond the immediate military situation and involve the powerful reaction of the non-communist world to the challenges posed by the Red assault last June. New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey stepped into the explosive $20 million gambling ring scandal in Brooklyn yesterday. He made a date for today with acting Mayor Vincent Impetorelli and the new police commissioner, Thomas F. Murphy, Dewey's secretary, told Newsman. The governor gravely concerned about disclosures of widespread corruption in the city of New York. He will discuss them with the acting mayor and police commissioner. University of Tennessee officials in Knoxville wrestled for 2 hours yesterday with the legal aspect of admitting Negro students before postponing a final decision for possibly 30 days. The Board of Trustees said it had given due consideration to a ruling by State Attorney General Roy H. Beeler that qualified Negroes may not be barred from the university's professional school. In Los Angeles, Leo O'Brien, a Negro, wants an annulment of his marriage to Jean Ann Bryan on the grounds that she falsely represented herself as a Negro. Bryan, in the suit filed in Superior Court on Wednesday, said he learned after their marriage in Yuma, Arizona last December 1st that his wife is Caucasian. He also learned that he charges that she is 34, not 25 as she claimed. And those some of the day's top news stories as reported in the newspapers of Friday, September 29th, 1950, on your Radio Wanted, which continues following these important words on this Thursday edition of Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox. We'll close out this week of Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox with an episode of My Favorite Husband, starring Lucille Ball and Richard Denning, going back to September 30th, 1949, the Women's Club election. Liz is hopeful for a high post in the Women's Club election. Unfortunately, she got a post she didn't want. Treasurer. That's coming up on Friday's Classic Radio Theater. But now the conclusion of Wanted from 72 years ago, September 29th, 1950.
Lieutenant Alvin Stewart and Gladys Tibbet Glasgow were married in the spring of the year 1939.
Now everyone thought the past was buried. Now Gladys had a new start. There's an old adage, you can't escape your past. Gladys couldn't. Right after her marriage to the lieutenant, she seemed nervous about something. And each succeeding day, that nervousness grew. She'd tell the neighbors sometimes that she was worried. Sometimes she wouldn't talk at all. Just walk around the backyard of her house, hugging the child to her, jumping at the sound of the wind in the trees, and crying out at any sudden noise. Lots of folks thought Gladys was imagining things, having a breakdown. And then...
October 12th, 1939.
That morning, Gladys had been crying. She was almost frantic. She told the neighbors, I'm afraid, not for myself, but I'm afraid for Danny. But she wouldn't tell anyone who she was afraid of.
During the night of October 12th, 1939, the intruder broke in and shot both Gladys and her husband.
After the shooting, Gladys Glasgow Stewart said she knew she was going to die. She was taken to the hospital unconscious. County Attorney Hester kept a vigil outside her door, while Purcell Sheriff Edgman went to work gathering the details of the case.
He got a description of the murderer.
I saw him. He walks with a limp. I heard him talk. I know who he is.
He got a description of the gun.
38 Colt revolver. It's registered.
He got a description placing the murderer at the scene of the crime.
And he got a motive, if you can call it that.
The day Gladys married young Lieutenant Stewart, it started.
He was jealous of the lieutenant. Not jealous like an ordinary guy, but different. He started to think about it, brooding, kind of, thinking up ideas all the time.
Then he had trouble on the job. You see, he was a guard at the penitentiary at Granite City. Suddenly, he seemed to go to pot. He was acting strange and sick. They gave him a leave of absence, thinking he needed a rest.
He needed a rest, but he didn't get it. He had more time on his hands to think about Gladys and the lieutenant. There was nothing she did that he didn't know about. Stand watching her house, waiting for a look at her and a look at that kid Danny.
That night of the murder, he drove to see his brother. It was after midnight. Funny thing, no one knew what was really in his mind. He said he was depressed and upset. He threatened to commit suicide. Then as he left his brother's house, he mentioned that he wanted to take one last look at Gladys.
Yes, Sheriff Edgman found out everything there was to know about the shooting. Then word came from the hospital that Gladys Glasgow Stewart had recovered consciousness.
Sheriff Edgman, we immediately went into Oklahoma City, into the St. Anthony Hospital, and got another statement from Gladys about what happened at the residence. She said that Raymond Glasgow was the man that shot her.
Shortly after noon, Gladys Glasgow Stewart died. And Raymond Glasgow, ex-father-in-law Glasgow, kindly grandfather of the many gifts, was wanted for a double murder.
Glasgow had disappeared. He lit out right after the shooting. Purcell police spread the word to the Oklahoma State Police. Roadblocks were set up, and word was received.
This is Officer Ron Wheatley, Lawton Police Department, Lawton, Oklahoma. I received a long-distance telephone call from Sheriff Edgman, Sheriff of McLean County, Oklahoma. He stated that Raymond Glasgow, who was a resident of Lawton, Oklahoma, was wanted for murder and for us to be on the lookout for him. Before I could notify our mobile units and police patrolmen of the wanted notice on Raymond Glasgow, he came into the police station and identified himself and stated that he was wanted for murder in McLean County and wanted to give up. I immediately booked Glasgow and telephoned Sheriff Edgman that we had him in custody. Sheriff Edgman stated that he'd be right down after him and return him to McLean County, where he was tried for murder.
Raymond Glasgow, 46-year-old father-in-law of the gorgeous Gladys, went before the jury. At first, he entered a plea of not guilty. Later, he changed that plea to guilty. The state tried to get the maximum sentence, the chair, but there were extenuating circumstances.
This is Dr. Frank Kane. Dr. Griffin, superintendent of the Central State Hospital over at Norman, interviewed Raymond Glasgow and turned in the following report. Glasgow is suffering from a mental condition and is what the medical profession terms a psychopathic patient. A man in this condition is much more likely to commit such crimes since he is under much less restraint than a normal person. Any person in Glasgow's mental condition is very dangerous and should be kept apart from other people for the remainder of his life.
With this report in mind, the jury returned a guilty verdict, but recommended clemency.
Raymond Glasgow was sentenced at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary for the rest of his normal life.
This is Warden Burford, the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAllister, Oklahoma. Raymond Glasgow was received here the 9th of November, 1939. Being a farmer and having served as a guard at Granite, it was only 6 years until he was made a trustee. When he was made trustee, he was assigned to the dairy barn under supervision of Mr. John Yarber.
This is John Yarber, superintendent of the dairy at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. When Raymond Glasgow came out the barn as a trustee, we had him working in the milk room for about 2 weeks. And he was very efficient in there. And I talked to him and found that he knew a lot about cattle, and he was good on figuring feed and percentage of protein in it and stuff like that. I made him my clerk, and he worked in the office for 2 years. He was also made to sleep out. He used to sleep here all night, and the guard would check him every 2 hours. However, on the night of April 17th, 1948, when the guard came along at 3 in the morning, why, Raymond wasn't there. We immediately put out a statewide alarm.
A statewide alarm for a double murderer. A man emotionally unstable, a psychopath. The alarm spread from Oklahoma through the entire Midwest. But from the moment of his escape until the present moment, no word at all has been heard of Raymond Glasgow. It is not our function here to determine the guilt or innocence of a man, nor do we intend to. But according to the facts you've heard tonight, and or other pertinent material, Raymond Glasgow is wanted.
Here again is Walter McGraw.
You can help find Raymond Glasgow. Remember, you, the listener, have already run up an impressive record with the apprehension of 3 of the fugitives whose case histories we've broadcast. But to bring Glasgow to justice, you must be informed of all the facts. What does he look like? How does he dress? What are his habits? These we will give you, so stand by. How can you recognize him? Listen, and listen carefully.
This is Warden Burford, Raymond Glasgow, age 58 years, height 5 feet 8 inches, weight 172 pounds, medium build, hair blonde gray, teeth good, tattoo of horseshoe, horse head and whip, inside right arm, tattoo of dagger and heart inside of left arm between the elbow and wrist.
Now back to Walter McGraw in New York.
If you should see Raymond Glasgow, don't approach him on the street. Remember, this man is mentally ill, a psychopath. He may be very dangerous. Simply call your own local police. Tell them that you've seen Raymond Glasgow, an escapee from Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAlester, Oklahoma. Remember that. Raymond Glasgow is wanted by the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAlester. This is his description.
Raymond Glasgow is 58 years of age, 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighing 172 pounds. He has blue eyes, graying blonde hair, and light skin. He has a half-inch cut scar on the side of his palm near the thumb. The inside of his right arm, between the elbow and wrist, is tattooed a horseshoe, a horse's head, and a whip. His left arm is tattooed in the same place with a dagger and a heart.
To date, we've presented case histories on 12 of the most dangerous fugitives at large in this country. You, the listener, have brought to justice 3 out of the 12, an impressive record, a good job. But 9 of these men are still at large. 9 dangerous fugitives are still loose. So let's look at the scoreboard and bring these 9 bums in. Who are they?
Myron Mike Selleck, wanted for unlawful flight by the FBI.
Mikey Selleck is a former member of Detroit's Purple Gang. He was convicted of armed robbery and conspiracy to commit murder. Selleck is one of the most dangerous men at large today. He was a key figure in the sensational murder of Michigan State Senator Warren G. Hooper. Directly after our broadcast on July 14th, we received word that Selleck was in Los Angeles, California, but he escaped a police dragnet there. Additional word has come in since then. Myron Mike Selleck has been in or near Cleveland, Ohio. Myron Mike Selleck was seen near or in Cleveland, Ohio. If you know of his present whereabouts, report it at once to the FBI.
Glenroy Wright, wanted for jailbreak.
The latest information on this big-time bum, hothead, and trigger-happy gunman is that he's in Dallas, Texas, working with a Dallas mob. Did you hear that, Texas? This is your baby. Look for him. Report him to the FBI.
Kenneth Wagner, wanted for jailbreak.
Kenneth Wagner, the 5-time admitted killer who was a hero in his own hometown, is still at large. Although there have been numerous communications with this program assuring us Wagner wants to give himself up so that his case can be reconsidered, none of these mystery voices have paid off. Meanwhile, he's still wanted by the warden of Parchman Prison in Mississippi.
The C Brothers.
Thurman and Troy C. are practitioners of a confidence game which has robbed innocent thousands. Right after the wanted broadcast, we were advised by the Zanesville, Ohio police that they'd had tips reporting the C's to be in their area, but no capture resulted. So watch out when you're asked to cash a check by a stranger. All information concerning the C's should be directed to the attention of the District Attorney's Office, Denver, Colorado. They are wanted there.
Henry Clay Tillett.
We've had no word at all on Henry Clay Tillett, but keep on the lookout for him. Remember, this makeup artist who disguises himself as an Indian is one of the FBI's 10 most wanted men in America today. California still looks like the best bet.
Fred the Angel Tenuto.
Fred Tenuto, the gun punk who likes to kill, has struck again. His last robbery that we know about was in Pittsburgh. Remember, Fred Tenuto is number 2 public enemy. He's dangerous and he's tricky. Our latest information places him once again in New York City.
Willie the Actor Sutton.
Willie Sutton is number 1 public enemy. The voice of the underworld has the latest information on him.
This bird Sutton is a smart guy. I once told you that he knows his stuff. He never works with the same gang more than once. And the reason he don't do it is because he don't want anybody to be able to put the finger on him. But now he changed. He's working with a partner named Tom Kling. You remember I told you about Tom Kling? This guy can be spotted easy now because recently he pulled a holdup and got a bust on the head. and he's got a scar that anybody can recognize. And this guy is also tattooed from head to foot. Now, if you want to pick both of them up, and the best way to do it is first find Kling because he hasn't got any brains. He's the guy that'll ultimately lead you to Sutton. If you want to find both of them, hit the waterfronts. If you hear of a big-time racket right on the waterfront, you're going to get a beautiful whiff of Sutton and Kling.
9 fugitives at large, 9 dangerous criminals still out free to rob and murder unless you stop them. Many of you might have information concerning any one of these men. If you've seen them, or if you think you know someone who might have information about them, notify the authorities or write directly to me, Walter McGraw, care of Wanted, NBC, New York. All mail will be considered confidential unless you otherwise specify. Remember, be sure of all your facts and give all details in your letter. Write directly to me, Walter McGraw, care of Wanted, NBC, New York. That's Walter McGraw, Wanted, NBC, New York. Now, this is Walter McGraw saying there's no time like now to wipe out crime.
Watch for the return of Wanted when you will again hear the actual people give their eyewitness accounts of the country's most dangerous fugitives who are wanted. Wanted by the police of the nation.
All material heard tonight was factual from the record. Pseudonames were used for Mr. and Mrs. Traynor for their safety. All other names were real. Tonight's report was written by P.L. Mayer. Music was by Morris Pomorsky. William Meader was at the organ. The narrator was Fred Collins. Wanted was supervised for NBC by Joel Hamill and produced and directed by Walter McGraw.
The last show of the summer series, Wanted, 72 years ago, September 29th, 1950. And yes, they did find 3 of them, didn't they? Thank you for tuning in to Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox. September 29th, 1950, 72 years ago today. Visit our webpage, classicradio.stream. Please thank this station, support their advertisers, tell your friends. The great radio shows are right here at this spot on the dial. Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox on your favorite station.